Hey guys, tonight we're talking quietly about something that has survived far longer than anyone expected. Some medieval rules were meant to vanish, yet they quietly persisted. Imagine walking down a quiet street at night, thinking everything is modern and new, yet the shadow of centuries old rules is silently guiding the way you move, the way you speak, even the way you think. These weren't just written laws in thick, dusty books. They were traditions whispered across generations, habits shaped by centuries of fear, respect, and habit. You might think some of these rules are long gone, lost to history, yet they are alive in the smallest corners of daily life. You obey them without even knowing because they have become invisible, natural, woven into the ordinary in a way that feels unquestionable. Think of the strange regulations that medieval towns had. Some forbade people from walking in certain streets at certain hours or required them to wear specific colors if they belonged to a particular social class. Today, these seem absurd, almost like fairy tales, but back then, they were serious matters. And what's fascinating is some of these rules didn't just vanish when the medieval period ended. They mutated, shifted, and survived in ways that we rarely notice. Rules about who could sit where, who could speak in public, and even who could sell what in the marketplace all lingered, often quietly enforced by the inertia of habit rather than any legal threat. It's not only about laws, customs and social expectations were a powerful form of regulation. There were rules about how a woman should dress in public or how a man should behave at the dining table. Some of these customs were intended to maintain order, while others were tied to superstition or religion. Yet, even when society evolved, some customs survived because people continued to pass them on without question. You might sit at a formal dinner today and follow unspoken rules that were first observed hundreds of years ago. You might smile politely, wait to be served, or use phrases that have been spoken for centuries. You are living in the shadow of rules created long before you were born, quietly persisting in your manners and expectations. Consider the legal side. Medieval towns and kingdoms had countless laws that seem ridiculous today, like rules about the width of your door, or the shape of your roof, or even which animals you were allowed to keep within city walls. These laws were often rooted in safety concerns, fire prevention, or social hierarchy. While most were eventually abolished officially, some didn't vanish immediately. Instead, they lingered in local traditions, ignored by courts, but remembered by communities. Families passed down these rules as stories or warnings. Don't paint your door this way. Don't let chickens roam freely. Don't speak to strangers at night. And in subtle ways, these rules shape the architecture, the habits, and the mindset of people for generations. Even everyday language carries echoes of medieval rules. Many expressions we use today originated as rules or formal commands, phrases that sound like casual advice. Mind your manners, don't speak out of turn, stand in line, once held the weight of law or severe social penalty. When you hear them, they may seem like polite suggestions, but they are the whispers of centuries old regulations. They survive the passage of time not because anyone enforced them with a sword or threat, but because generations repeated them, unknowingly keeping the rules alive. And it's not just about obedience. Some rules persisted because they were convenient, a framework that society found useful even as the original reason for the rule faded away. For example, markets and guilds had very strict rules about trade, pricing, and production quality. When the economic system evolved, these rules didn't disappear entirely. They became norms, quietly guiding how people worked, bought, and sold. You might not know the exact medieval law behind the regulation, but you live under its shadow if you follow certain professional etiquette or business practice. The most interesting part is how these rules survived without anyone explicitly enforcing them. Fear of punishment was only part of it. Many survived because people didn't question them, because breaking them felt like breaking the rhythm of life itself. Society had woven these rules into morality, religion, and culture so deeply that forgetting them felt unnatural. Imagine trying to do something perfectly legal today, but socially unacceptable because a rule from centuries ago still shapes perception. That's the quiet persistence I'm talking about. The medieval world didn't vanish overnight. Parts of it still guide us in ways we rarely recognize. Even architecture and city planning carry these invisible rules. Narrow streets, public squares, the layout of marketplaces, all were influenced by rules, often based on safety, social order, or control. Modern cities may seem entirely separate from the medieval mindset, yet some patterns persist. A building code here, a zoning restriction there, a particular way of marking public spaces. These are shadows of old rules that were meant to disappear but didn't. And the fascinating part, the rules we follow today without question might themselves become tomorrow's mysterious medieval laws. Think about it. What seems normal and natural now, traffic laws, etiquette, work habits, might be studied centuries from now as rules that persisted far beyond their original purpose. That continuity is what makes history feel alive, not just as events, but as behavior, as the quiet, unnoticed instructions that shape daily life. So when you obey something without thinking, pause for a moment. Ask yourself, is this rule truly necessary? Or is it a ghost of the past surviving because generations have repeated it without question? Some medieval rules were supposed to end. They were outdated, irrelevant, and unnecessary. Yet here they are, quietly persisting in manners, habits, language, architecture, and social behavior. They survive not with swords or judges, but with silence and repetition. You follow them every day, often without realizing it, living alongside echoes of centuries old laws and customs. And yet, even when some rules should have faded into history, they didn't. Many medieval regulations, seemingly outdated, were still enforced in surprising ways, quietly lingering in daily life. Imagine a rule about who could eat what or when a certain type of food was allowed. Today, it might seem absurd to restrict a meal based on age, rank, or gender, yet in medieval towns, these rules were strictly observed. And even after the world moved on, some of these food regulations survived, embedded in customs and etiquette. Families, communities, and even local authorities continue to follow them, sometimes without thinking, sometimes out of fear of social disapproval. The persistence of these rules often came from habit. When people have followed a way of life for generations, questioning it becomes strange, almost uncomfortable. If your grandparents insisted on doing something in a particular way, you might continue it because it feels right, even when the reason behind it no longer exists. This is how old rules hide themselves, becoming invisible patterns that guide behavior quietly but powerfully. For instance, the way we set a table, the order in which meals are served, or even who gets to sit at the head of the table. Many of these seemingly polite gestures are shadows of medieval rules that were never meant to survive. Fear also played a big role. Some rules were enforced not through law, but through social pressure. Breaking them could mean shame, gossip, or exclusion from a community. Even when the legal enforcement disappeared, the fear remained. People obeyed not because someone threatened them with punishment, but because generations had conditioned them to believe that disobedience would bring disgrace. This is why some customs and practices continued for centuries after their original purpose was gone, surviving quietly in manners, clothing, and social interactions. Bureaucracy, too, kept rules alive longer than expected. Medieval kingdoms had complex systems of record keeping, taxation, and administrative oversight. Many of these rules were intended to simplify governance or maintain order. Yet, bureaucracies are notoriously slow to adapt. Officials continued enforcing regulations that were no longer relevant because that was the way things were done. Over time, these regulations became traditions, routines, and habits, even as the world outside changed dramatically. For example, certain town inspections, trade certifications, or community obligations persisted for decades after their practical purpose had vanished. Some of these continuations were almost comical. Imagine a rule about how many steps you could take in a public square, or when you could ring a bell, or even what kinds of hats were allowed. To us, it sounds silly, but for centuries, people respected and followed these rules because questioning them was unthinkable. And the more society changed, the stranger it became to realize that these rules were still quietly shaping behavior. Social etiquettes were another surprising area where old rules persisted. Medieval etiquette was often complex, dictating everything from posture to conversation to even which gestures were acceptable. As centuries passed, society modernized, yet many of these manners continued.